Data model is a collection of concepts that which we are using in order to have a description of a database. If I say student entity, then student is the name of an entity and student attributes will be used together. What I can say, that is an entity type. If we have this primary key or key attribute, with the help of that I can identify the entity in a unique manner. Mainly we are going to use this model in order to define the data elements and relationship for a specified system. Hello everybody, a warm welcome to one and all. Welcome back to the session 1 of chapter 2 in the unit 1 of B.Ca's third semester, subject called Database Management System. In short, it is Dbms. I am Rohini TS, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, first grade college, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. So in our today's session, we're going to see what you mean by ER model. Along with that, I will let you know what are the ER model concepts we have. Along with this first topic, I will be discussing what you mean by an entity and what are the types of entities we have, that is entity type, and also I will be discussing regarding entity set, and at last we'll see what you mean by an attribute and what are the different types of attribute we have. So we'll see the first topic, that is regarding ER model or ER model concepts. Already you know about the data model, that is what we have learned in the previous sessions. So as you all know that data model is a collection of concepts that which we are using in order to have a description of a database. So for that reason we are going to have a data model, and here we have a ER model, that is entity relationship model. This is also considered as what? High level data model. Moreover, it stands for entity relationship model. In short, that is ER model, and it is high level or conceptual level data model. So here we can expect more abstraction. That is what we are having in the ER model. Mainly we are going to use this model in order to define the data elements and relationship for a specified system. So your main concerning is regarding what are the different data elements we have, that means an entity, and what is the relationship between one entity to another entity. Already you all know regarding the conceptual data model. There we are describing a description of a database in the terms of an entity, an attribute, as well as the relationship. So that entity is what do you mean by an attribute, along with what is the relationship or association between the different entities. By that methodology we are describing or we are having this ER model, and mainly develops a conceptual design for the database. As I told earlier, here we are going to have a conceptual schema. By making use of that, we can have a conceptual design. If we have a conceptual design, then we are going to describe the data elements and their relationship among the different data elements. And also, it develops a very simple and easy to design view of data with the help of this diagrammatic representation. We call that as what? Entity relationship diagram, or we also call this as a ER diagram. So with the help of this entity relationship diagram or ER diagram, we can show the database structure which will going to be displayed as a diagram. As we all know that what one image is equal to 1000 words. Instead of keep on explaining regarding certain scenario, if I am showing a pic to you, then it will be easy for you to understand. Same thing here, we are going to have a diagrammatic representation of a database structure. Then we call that as a entity relationship diagram or ER diagram. With the help of this, we are describing or we are explaining this ER model. Mainly, in order to do the designing or definition of a data elements and its relation, we have this ER model. I hope you all understood regarding this ER model. So now we'll see what you mean by an entity, what is an attribute, and what is relationship one by one. First, we'll see what you mean by an entity. Any real world object is considered as what? An entity. So this is what real world object. It can be either animated or inanimated. It can be physically present or logically present, and also can be easily identifiable with a particular attributes or properties. We are going to find out the real world object. If I consider a water bottle, how can I get to know that is a water bottle? It will going to have certain feature. It has a cap, it has a container, it will going to have certain shape, color, belongs to particular company or manufacturer. With the help of all those attributes, we can identify an entity. So that can be any real world element or an object. An entity may be an object with physical existence, or it may be an object with conceptual existence. So it can be physically or virtually or logically may present in the database. So we'll see what are the categories we have in an entity. It is of two types. One is tangible entity and another one is intangible entity. When it comes to the tangible entity, and entities are those entities which exist in the real world physically. So if you consider a person, if you consider an employee, department, school, colleges, car, so all those are what? Physically we have a existence for all those entity, that object. Then we call that kind of entity as tangible entity. Then what about this intangible entity? So which entities are those entities which exist only logically, which is not physically present but in conceptual manner or in the logical manner that are present, but they have no physical existence. You can take the railway reservation system and you can take the bank account. So all those are not physically existed, they have it in the terms of logical existence or conceptual existence. Okay, so all these entities have some attributes or properties that will going to give the identity for this entity. If I consider bank account as an entity, then how can I get to know that is bank account? That will going to have a bank ID and that is located in particular location, that may be related to particular person or individual. So with the help of certain attribute or property, we are going to identify what kind of an entity it is. Fine, this is regarding an entity. Next we'll see about the entity types. What do you mean by an entity type? So here an entity type describe a set of entity. What it is describing? It is a collection of entities or set of entity that have the same attribute, but each entity has its own values for each attribute. So here I have a set of entities or collection of entity. All the entities will going to have a same attribute, but the value of an attribute will be differ from one attribute to another attribute. Then we call that as a entity type. Remember, I am going to have a student entity, I am going to have a teacher entity. Okay, so all these will going to have a student ID, student name, phone number, like that, and this teacher will going to have a teacher's ID, teacher's name, age and their date of birth as well as salary. So that all these attribute will going to have a same attribute, but that attributes will, value of attributes will be differ from one entity to another entity. Then we call that as what? Entity type. It will be a collection of entities or a set of entity that have a same attribute. If I consider a student 1, student 2, student 3, all the entity will going to have a same attribute. Every student has student ID, name, age, date of birth and parents detail. So all attributes are same for student 1, student 2, student 3 as well. But the value of all those attributes will going to be differ from one student to another student. Then we call that as what? Entity type. So set of entity types define the part of database schema. So whenever we have a collection of entity types, then that will going to be defined as a subpart of database schema, and each entity type in the database is described by the name and attributes. If I say student entity, then student is the name of an entity and student attributes will be used together. What I can say, that is an entity type. So that an entity type in the database will going to be described by its name as well as the attribute, and for each entity type there will be a multiple entities of that type. As I said earlier, if I consider a student entity, then there may be n number of students, there may be 10 number of students. So each entity will going to have want to store the data in the database, and each of them described by the same collection of attribute. Even student 1 and student 50, both are will going to have a same attribute. The value of an attribute will be differ from one entity to another entity. The value of those attribute will be differ from one entity to another entity. This is what you all need to remember. Okay, and then entity type will going to serve as a template. So for what reason we are considering this as a template or a standard? For a collection of entity instances. So here already you know what is snapshot or what is instance. So when it comes to the entity instance, what is the entity value at a particular moment? Then we call that as an entity instance. So then it will be a collection of instances. If you take an example of objects and classes. So class is what? Class is a template that will going to hold a collection of object. Then we are calling that object as an entity instance, and that class will going to perform the role of this entity type. Same way, this entity type is a set or collection of this entity instances, all which we are described by the same collection of attribute. Same collection of attribute will be there, but the values of an attribute will be different from one entity to another entity. Then how do we represent this entity type in a ER diagram? So each entity type is denoted by a rectangular box. So we are going to use a rectangular box in order to specify this entity type in a ER diagram. Fine. Then here you can see what are the different entity types we have. We have a strong entity type and weak entity type. What do you mean by strong or weak in the entity type? Here you have an answer for that. Here we have a strong entity. As I told earlier, each entity will going to have its own attribute. If we have any key attribute, in order to identify that entity uniquely, then we can say that as a strong entity. For example, I have 50 students in one class. Okay, and each student will going to have a name, ID, age, roll number, as well as their date of birth and the course taken. Fine. Then how can I say that this is a particular student, or how can we recognize that as a particular student? So there may be a chances of having a same name. There could be a chances of having same address, but each student will going to have a unique roll number or unique ID. With that help of that roll number or unique ID, we are identifying a student. So when an entity has a key attribute, in order to make it unique, then we can say that kind of entity as what? Strong entity. So which has a key attribute. With the help of this key attribute, I am identifying that entity uniquely. So that the primary key will going to help us in order to identify each entity in the unique manner. So if we have this primary key or key attribute, with the help of that I can identify the entity in a unique manner, and it will be represented with the help of rectangle also. And as I taken the example of roll number, that is going to helpful for us in order to identify the student entity uniquely. Then what about this example? Here you can see that here we have a student. As I told earlier, it will going to be in the ER diagram, we are going to use a rectangle symbol in order to represent the entity. This is strong entity. How can I say this is strong entity? Because here I have a key attribute. So the attribute will going to be given or described with the help of this oval. So if I have a name of an attribute which is underlined, then we can say that as a key attribute or a primary key. So all the students we have here. So with the help of this roll ID or roll number, I can specify or I can identify a student uniquely. Then we can say that as a strong entity type. So here we have a age, name. Age could be same. If you have in a class, age could be same. Gender could be same. Even their name could also be same. But we can identify them with their roll number or roll ID. Then we can say this as what? Strong entity type. Then what about this weak entity type? It is just a vice versa of that strong entity. If we have a key attribute to identify an entity, strong entity. If we don't have a key attribute to identify an entity, then weak entity. So weak entity type does not have any key attribute. So it can't be identified by on its own. You just imagine you are in some marriage functions or something. What people used to ask, so neen our maga alva, your maglalva. That is what it means. People are identifying you by your parent, so that parent will going to play a strong entity and their attribute is inheriting to you. That means you are identifiable with your parent. So you are weak entity type. When we don't have our own key attribute, in order to identify an entity type uniquely, then we can say that as a weak entity type. So it depends on some other strong entity for its distinct identity. As I taken the example now, there can be children only if the parents exist. So this children can be identifiable or uniquely identifiable only when we have this parent exist or parent entity. So that parent entity will going to play a strong entity role. With the help of that, we are identifiable. That is what weak entity type. Fine. Here you can see the next thing. So there can be no independent existence of children if there is no parent exist, and it is represented by a double outline rectangle. How do we represent the strong entity? With a rectangle. If it is weak entity, then it will be double lined or double outline rectangle. Fine. And we are going to use a diamond symbol or rhombus symbol in order to specify the relationship. So here the relationship between a weak entity type and strong entity type is called an identifying relationship. Understand? I have a weak entity, I have a strong entity. I wanted to build a relationship between these two, and we are going to use this rhombus or diamond symbol in order to give a relationship between the weak and strong. Then we are calling that relationship as what? Identifying relationship. Then how do we write this in the ER diagram? It will be with the terms of double outline diamond instead of writing a single outline diamond. Imagine here I have a strong entity and here we have a weak entity. How do I get to know this is strong and weak? If it is a double outlined rectangle, weak. If it is a single outlined rectangle, strong. Now I wanted to have a relationship between this strong and weak entity. Then instead of writing it in the single diamond, we have to write double outlined rhombus or diamond shape. Why? Because this is going to help us in order to identify the relationship between strong and weak entity, and this specifies the identifying relationship. Here you can see that an example. Here we have weak entity type address and we have a customer as a strong entity type, and here we have a customer ID, that is key attribute, mobile number, age, name and gender. This customer has an address. How do I get to know the address of that person? That will going to be depend on a entity called customer. Why? Because each customer will going to have their address. So that this specifies the identifying relationship, and this is weak entity type. And in order to find the address, I require town, I require locality as well as state as an attribute. This is how we are going to represent the relationship between strong as well as weak entity type. I hope you all understood regarding this entity type. Let me move to the next concept, that is regarding entity set. So till now we got to know we have an entity type that will going to specify a collection of attributes, or it will going to have a set of entities with the same attribute. The value of an attribute will be different. But here we are going to have a entity set. It is a collection of similar types of entity. This will going to have a similar type of entity, and here entity set is the collection of all the entities of a particular type that exist. This is entity set. So there we have a same kind of entity. Then we are making that as a group. Then we call that as a entity set at some moment in time. That is entity instance. Then an entity set may contain entities with an attribute sharing a similar value. Remember, this is just only one difference between the entity type and entity set. This is also a collection of entities of a same type of a particular type. If I say the student entity, then only students. If I say the employee entity, only employee entity. So here we have an entity. That entity has an attribute or features or properties which are sharing similar values. Then that is what only the difference between the entity set as well as the type. Then example, if student set, if I say student set as an entity set, that may contains all the students of a school. Same way, if I say teacher set, teachers will going to have a collection of faculties or a teacher. All attributes somehow may share the similar values. But if we have a different value for each attribute, that is entity type. There could be collection of student, employee, employee has a ID, employee ID, student has a ID. We have a same kind of attribute, but the values are different in the entity type. Whenever we have a similar value for a particular attribute, then we call that as an entity set. And this entity set need not to be just disjoint. We'll see the example here. We have a two entity type here, employee and company, and employee consists of employee 1 up to employee n. Same way, company will going to have company 1 to company n. So all entity will going to have its own attribute with values, and here we have a entity set. So here you can see that entity type describes the schema or intention for a set of entities that share the same structure. So entity type specify a set of entities that share the same structure. In the entity set, the collection of entities of a particular entity type. We are mainly focusing on a particular type. Then we call that as a entity set, grouped into an entity set, and which is also called as extension of the entity type. First we have a entity type, and if I am taking a collection of entity type, then that become entity set. Then we can say that as a extension. This is intention and this is extension. Fine. This is what the example for entity type and entity set. This is one entity, this is one entity type. These two are the different entity type. If I am taking these together, then it will be an entity set. I hope you all understood regarding this entity set. Let me move to the next concept. That's all regarding attributes. If I consider the ER model, there I have an entity, attribute as well as the relationship. We got to know what is an entity, what is entity type, what is entity set. Now we'll start with this attribute. As we all know that this is what consists of properties or features which we are using in order to identify a particular entity. This is giving identification to the entity, so that the entities are represented by means of their properties. Then we call that properties as what? Attributes. So these are the attributes or properties which define the entity type. If I wanted to say the particular thing as a student, then that student must have a student ID, name, register number, age, gender, address, like that. So all whatever I am saying will be considered as an attribute that specifies the properties or a features, and then this is represented by oval. So in the previous example, you might have seen this. We are going to use this oval symbol in order to represent an attribute, and all attribute will going to have their own values. If I consider a student entity, that will going to have a student name, class, age, and also they may have a student ID. All those are the attribute of a student entity, and this entity is described by its attribute, which are properties, categorizing it. With the help of this attribute, we are representing the entity, and each attribute will going to have its own values, and each value will going to be different from one entity to another entity, and the value of attribute may be same or different. So what are the different types of attribute we have here? We have a simple attribute, composite attribute, key attribute, and we have a single valued attribute, multi-valued attribute, and derived attribute. So these are the different type of attributes that we have. Keep your curiosity. Let me meet you in the next session with the types of an attribute, and also we'll see what you mean by a key attribute, and also we'll see what you mean by domain of an attribute. As we did for the entity set and entity type, same we have a relationship type and relationship set. Let me meet you in the next session. Until that, keep learning, keep on growing. Thank you.